Good morning. It's Richard Heald. Welcome to the UK-India Business Council webinar focusing on the recent Indian budget announcement. This was a billed to be a momentous event, being the first budget which Arun Jaitley and the NDA coalition government could reasonably claim to be entirely their own. So the expectations riding on the administration were extremely high, and those who were in India in the run-up to the budget will have seen the wall-to-wall coverage that occurred in the press and also on TV, giving a really clear indication of the level of expectations. I'm delighted to welcome James Crabtree, the FT's Mumbai correspondent, who's on the line, who's going to run through his views on the budget, and I'm also going to test him with some questions around that, particularly in relation to the legislative session, which is going on as well, and which is containing some equally important indicators of momentum of this government. But before we begin, I'd like to familiarise yourself with the toolbox on the right-hand side of your screens. And just to let you know, I know that some of you have listened into these webinars before, but it bears repeating. We will have everyone on mute during the course of the conversation to keep any background noise to a minimum. But if you have a question, please drop it into the little bracket on the toolbox on the right-hand side in the please type your question here box and send to me your question. We will take it up during the Q&A session at the end. But for now, to make sure you can all hear me clearly, could I please ask you all to raise your hand button on the toolbar, and if you could please click on the raise your hand button. Thank you very much. And I'm getting thumbs up from my colleagues, so I think that we're ready to go. James, good morning to you.
Good morning, Richard, or good afternoon from here in Mumbai. How are you today?
I'm fine. I'm fine. Obviously, there's been a lot going on. And I read your blog this morning with interest on tax terrorism and on the controversies around the coal auctions. But maybe if we could just start with the budget, and clearly expectations were extremely high.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Yeah, the budget, the expectations were extremely high. How do you think it played out generally, both to India in general, but also to the corporates, both Indian and international?
I think in your introduction, Richard, you were right to focus on this sort of cycle of expectations, which, to be fair, I mean, I've been in India for a little over 3 years now, and so I've seen 3 of these budgets, and the cycle is always the same. That almost immediately after the end of one budget, people start hyping up what might happen in the next one, and so inevitably there tends to be a degree of disappointment because everyone who wishes something to happen hopes that it will arrive in the annual budget, and it doesn't tend to work in that way. I think the consensus is that this budget was a reasonable compromise, but nothing terribly exciting. I mean, there's a sort of endless merry-go-round here about whether and when Mr. Modi's government will begin to introduce some much bigger, more structural reforms to the economy, and some people hoped that they might emerge in this budget, and generally they didn't. So you had some, I mean, I don't know if you, probably we can go through these individually with, but you know, there were some fairly positive things. The government pocketed the reduction in subsidies because of declines in oil prices and used some of that money for a little extra public investment, which should help the economy grow more quickly, spending about $11 billion on road projects and rail. they broadly kept to their fiscal plan. I mean, there was a slight slippage, but not one that tended to worry the market. Quite substantial moves to give extra money to the Indian states, which were broadly welcomed. And then some quite positive moves in other areas, some of which were about tax, a decline in corporation tax from 30% to 25% over a number of years, which businesses will like, promises of a new bankruptcy law, a few changes in tax that people had been worried about, a thing called GAR, an anti-avoidance regime, which they kicked into the long grass. I mean, the negatives, I suppose, were, as sort of one op-ed writer put it, there was nothing very much in this that required a great deal of bravery or anything terribly surprising. Certainly hopes that the government might tackle some more sort of unpopular issues like reforms to subsidies or labour market laws didn't come about. And on taxes, I think we may begin to talk about in a minute, given what has happened to Cairn Energy, the British energy exploration company in the last few days, that there was no progress in particular on some of the larger issues that have vexed foreign companies. So broadly speaking, the market sort of took this in its stride. There was a little bit of disappointment; it wasn't better, but nothing substantial. And then the RBI governor, a couple of days after the budget, did another surprise cut in interest rates, which everyone sort of interpreted as giving his approval to the budget, which was sort of basically had reasonable assumptions on growth and tax, and that he was sort of happy with this and happy to cut interest rates again off the back of it. So nothing terribly exciting, but nothing terribly bad either. I think that tends to be the consensus on it.
I think the word I've seen is politically cleverly balanced, appealing to both the social imperatives that seem to impact in India, but also tipping its hand and not being seen to be too business friendly, but not being complete wet blanket. You make one interesting observation, which I was going to deal with later, but since you've raised it, James, I'm going to ask you now. There are significant assumptions that are underpinning this budget, and one of the most significant is obviously the growth that the government is expecting to see in the economy. And the government has very recently revised, or the Ministry of Finance has revised the GDP numbers up quite significantly. And this budget and certainly the revenue numbers are assuming an 8.5% growth in terms of next year on GDP. There is some kind of skepticism, if I can put it like that, or maybe even merely a lack of clarity as to how the government has arrived at this very significant upgrade. And the RBI is actually asking for information as well. So in order to look at the actual underpinning of the budget and the growth that we're seeing, what's your view and take on all of that?
Well, I think you've got to separate it into two separate issues. There's about 6 weeks, 2 months ago, the way the sort of statistical office in India recalculated the way that some growth figures were put together, and the result was that India's growth suddenly looked much rosier. There has been some doubt as to whether they have done this accurately and whether it therefore accurately reflects what's really going on in the economy. A number of economists, and according to some people the RBI, are a bit skeptical that India is really growing as quickly as these new figures suggest that it has been, sort of above 7%, given other indicators of slack in the economy. So, but there's a sort of separate issue that, given that they're now using those figures as their headline growth rate, which are higher, are they making reasonable assumptions in this budget on things like tax? And actually most economists seem to think that they are. The last budget in India made some quite heroic assumptions on how quickly, for instance, tax revenues would increase, which is what they call tax buoyancy, which turned out to be very optimistic, and so had the government not had the benefit of the cut in oil prices, it would have missed its fiscal deficit target quite handily. As it was, it got lucky. Most economists seem to think that the assumptions in this year's budget are much more realistic, even something sort of slightly too cautious. Credit for that, I think, can go to Arvind Subramanian, the economist who took over as the government's chief economic advisor sort of at the beginning of the year or the end of last year, and he has sort of kind of made that much more credible. And so most economists seem to think that the actual numbers in the budget are perfectly reasonable.
Okay. Looking at the budget, as you say, Jaitley has taken advantage of all the luck that has come his way, including declining commodity prices and oil prices, etc. But nevertheless, he's rolled back a lot of the benefits, the immediate benefits, as you mentioned. The corporation tax clicks in over the next reduction in corporation tax clicks in over the next 4 years. One could argue the $12 billion that is going to go into infrastructure, that won't feed into the economy for another 12, 18 months. There are also arguably reheated numbers on healthcare and defence that he talked about. There isn't, over the next 12 months or so, there's nothing that industry sees that will immediately pump prime the economy. It's kind of steady as you go. And one of the issues is, do you really think this is going to unlock investment and underpin Make in India, or is it still going to be this kind of wait and see attitude that one has seen to date?
Well, I think the logic behind what they're doing, to be fair to them, is a little bit more positive than that. So that the extra money that's going into infrastructure, into rural roads, rail, urban housing, that $11–12 billion that they found down the back of the sofa, that should be spent this year. I mean, that's the logic of it. So you're right that some of the kind of knock-on effects in the economy won't be felt for longer than that. But that should benefit directly some, industries that are involved in in construction or in those particular sectors. Obviously it's only $11 billion, but the reason why they're doing that is because private investment has been so weak. The assumption was when Mr. Modi won the election last May that quick action from the government would help to unblock stalled infrastructure projects and provide confidence to investors, and therefore private companies, both foreign and domestic, would begin spending money again, building steel plants or expanding car factories, and really that hasn't happened. And because that hasn't happened, that's why the government has tried to change tack. They have recognized, I think, that the problems facing the private sector, particularly in heavy industries, problems of excessive debt, of an undercapitalized banking system, and caution amongst entrepreneurs, meaning the sort of Indian tycoons, about how easy it is to invest in India, that's going to take longer to work through. And so the point is that this public investment is meant to sort of be a bridging loan, as it were, while some of those issues get worked out. So I think that the logic of what they're doing is to suggest that there will be some public pump priming, as you called it, and that over the next couple of years, the issues affecting the private sector should get worked out gradually, and then they will be able to pick up the slack. So, I think that all makes some sense, and it's probably better that they have done that rather than just waiting for the private sector to get its act together, which shows little sign of actually happening, despite the generally rosy view of India's growth and what's happened to its equity markets.
Yeah, I have to say I like your analogy of bridge financing. Can we turn slightly to something that we haven't yet addressed, and you didn't mention in your excellent summary, which was the GST and the fact that we've now got a date confirmed as to when essentially India will become a common market, 1st of April 2016, and taking that into account, added to what you did talk about, which is the acceptance by the government of the 14th Finance Commission majority recommendations that a much larger percentage of central taxes get distributed to the states. There is something there which is actually quite fundamental in terms of changing what was previously under maybe the UPA government a rule from the centre to a governing from the centre. And the impact of that could be extremely significant. And I'm wondering if you can maybe just enlighten us a bit on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was one of the surprises in the budget that people didn't really expect, or at least my reading of it was I hadn't seen very many people expecting such a dramatic decentralization of funding. And one of the reasons why the finances were particularly tight was because they decided to accept these recommendations to move a lot of money down to the state level. What that means in practice, for instance, on what we were just talking about is that a lot of that new infrastructure spending is going to be spent by the states rather than the central government. And that in and of itself is in theory quite a good thing. I mean, one assumes that this money is better spent close to the ground. However, it invites plenty of questions about whether state governments have the capacity, or you might call it the shovel-ready projects in the American terms, to make good on this. But generally, the reception of this move has been pretty positive, and as you say, it's viewed as one of the more significant steps in the budget to, in a sense, match the rising economic importance of India's states and have that reflect in the central budget. On the goods and services tax, which you mentioned at the beginning, again, that was another positive. This is one of the major reforms that everyone has been waiting for, a British-style VAT that will cover the whole country. The IMF said yesterday that, assuming this comes in the way that people expect, this could enhance economic growth by something like 1 to 1.5%, which is, this counts as a fairly big bang reform. They still need to pass a number of pieces of legislation before it will happen, so there's still plenty that could go wrong. But generally speaking, the fact that they came up with a definite date by which it should happen was, that was welcomed and seen as a very positive step.
I mean, you could argue, if one wants him to be political with a big P on this, that the acceptance of the recommendations from the Finance Committee, which the government could have deferred because there was a minority opinion at a lower level, is facilitating the discussions and the passage of legislation on GST. But I think it's going to be a very important development, and one to follow significantly over the next 12 months or so. A question: were there any things that were missing from the budget that you would have liked to have seen? Were there things that you kind of expected, but they weren't there, or did you feel that, broadly speaking, it met your expectations in terms of announcements?
Oh, there were lots of little things. I mean, as you mentioned at the beginning, there's in the kind of hype cycle that precedes the budget, there's lots of speculation about what's likely to be in there, and people make assumptions about this and that. So there were plenty of things that I thought might well be in there that weren't, but they tend to be quite narrow. For instance, the removal of export duties on iron ore, which is important to get the Indian iron ore export industry going again. But in terms of what one might have liked to have seen, I mean, I suppose, I don't know whether you want to talk about tax, but there was no further progress, or no positive progress on this broad issue of retrospective tax, which worries a lot of multinationals. I mean, to be fair, there were little bits of progress. They clarified a few elements of how this law that was passed in 2012, which allows tax authorities to reopen old cases against foreign companies, was to be interpreted. But as we found out this week, the clarifications merely served to confirm that some of the cases that they were looking at were fine to go ahead with, particularly the one involving Cairn Energy, which we mentioned, that had a very dramatic effect on that company's share price. yesterday in London. Equally, while there were a few sort of positive steps on other areas of tax, this anti-avoidance regime that has worried a lot of foreign investors, and there were a few other things, they tended to be the government saying, don't worry, we're not going to do something that is sort of terribly harmful to foreign investors. They weren't making things better, they were not making things worse, if you see what I mean. The other thing I'd point to, I suppose, that some people thought would be in there would be reform of subsidies. So in the budget, to be fair to the government, there was a shift away from consumption, away from sort of subsidies and giveaways, and towards investment, which I think most economists would support. However, within that, the lion's share of that was because of lower fuel subsidies, and actually subsidies on areas like fertilizer and food went up a little bit. Now that in and of itself is not a bad thing, but what we didn't see was any change to the structure of India's sort of subsidy regime, which many people believe is sort of poorly targeted and quite wasteful. The government talked in abstract terms about, they came up with a new acronym which is called JAM, J-A-M, in which the J it stands for more bank accounts, the A stands for a unique identification scheme, and the M stands for mobile, and together they were claiming that these three things were going to have a dramatic effect on subsidies in the long term, but actually they didn't do anything in the short term to reform the way that subsidies are delivered, and that's something that many of those around Mr. Modi have been pushing him to do, but they haven't actually done that. So that was something that some people thought ought to be in there or would be in there, which wasn't.
There was an interesting announcement in relation to some 22 items in terms of import duties. Particularly, I understand that was directed exclusively towards the domestic electronics manufacturing industry. But apart from that, there wasn't huge structural changes on, as you say, on import duties, but was that a surprise to you?
Not particularly. I have to say that you've obviously ploughed through this budget document more closely than I have, Richard, because I didn't look at those changes in particular. It doesn't surprise me that the government would introduce a few changes to stop the inflow of certain types of electronics, or certain types of power equipment tends to be the other sort of capital goods equipment from China. This is quite controversial, but there certainly wasn't anything in the sort of structure of duties, import-export duties in this budget that really made a lot of headlines. So I think any changes that were brought in were fairly minor. The worry, and that's probably a good thing, because the worry is that while everybody broadly supports Prime Minister Modi's Make in India drive to try and increase the proportion of manufacturing as a sort of element of India's GDP, the worry is that this will be used as an excuse for a certain form of protectionism, in which politically well-connected Indian industries will lobby to have higher tariffs or duties against their foreign competitors. So broadly speaking, that didn't seem to happen, and I suppose you'd count that as a positive.
Mm-hmm. If we can turn to this thorny issue of retrospective taxation, and again, I commend anyone who's listening to log on and read James's blog. I don't know whether it appeared in the FT today as well. Did it?
It did. It did.
It did. Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, no FT, no comment. Please read. It is an extraordinary event in certain ways, insofar as you and I have listened to Modi, to Jaitley, to Sitaraman in London only a few months ago, saying there will be no retrospective taxation going forward. And here you have a situation where there was no demand until earlier this week, albeit what has come out is a 100-page document, as you rightly say, and it's I think firing the starting gun on a demand process. But nevertheless, it's extremely high profile, and insofar as retrospective taxation has become one of the most totemic issues in relation to ease of doing business within India, it is curious that that the tax authorities have pushed the button on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one to judge. I mean, I suppose I always sort of preface these comments by saying that I think there is a tendency amongst those who are sort of outside India or those who are foreign investors to think that the Indian tax authorities are always sort of chancing their arm in these circumstances, and that may not be true. I mean, foreign companies are very good at minimizing the amount of tax that they pay, and it's not out of the realms of possibility that some of them in India might sort of skirt the rules. Anyway, so having said that, in this case, certainly Cairn Energy feel very aggrieved by what's happened. You know, they claim that they paid all of their tax. And what appears to have happened is that while the government has said that they're not going to launch any new tax claims of this sort, because this one, in a sense, had been launched before, it was sort of pending, and because the clarifications that existed that were given in the budget didn't cover a case like Cairns, the tax authorities have thought, well, we might as well go ahead with it because the Finance Minister has said this is how we now interpret this law, the so-called retrospective amendment. These are the types of companies that fall within it, and these are the ones that don't. So, and the point the government there was trying to give investors certainty about how this would be, how this rule change would be interpreted in the future, so that they knew. But the effect on Cairn has been to say, well, actually, according to the letter of the Indian law, the tax authorities can go ahead. And so, if you're the Indian tax authorities and you're under pressure to raise tax revenue, which all tax authorities are, then the prospect of $1.6 billion is probably too good to pass up. And so I'm not sure quite how this plays politically. I mean, I suspect that this will have an effect, and unfortunately it will undo quite a lot of the positive work that has been done under Mr. Modi to try and make India's tax regime less adversarial, which is the word that they use. And I suppose it remains to be seen whether some kind of compromise can be reached. I mean, it's worth also reminding ourselves that although there has been some progress in other cases, that the famous sort of celebrated case that Vodafone has been battling with the government with for as long as I've been here and much longer, since 2007, is also unresolved. So while the government has made some progress, it sort of seems as if this tax issue is so ingrained that it's going to kind of pop up from time to time and slightly spoil the otherwise rosy picture of India's growth and the fact that it has a government which is making reasonable steps towards improving the investment environment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's purely coincidental, but as people are aware, Mr. Jaitley arrives on these shores in fact tomorrow morning, and UKIBC is hosting a business event tomorrow evening at which he's going to be speaking to some 300 people. But that's at the end of a day-long interactions with both UK government and also with City of London, etc. I mean, clearly this will be a live topic of discussion, and to a certain extent will, as you say, overshadow what I think is quite an important visit.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it will. I mean, I'm sure that this will be raised privately with him and probably publicly as well. I'd be interested to hear what he says. I mean, it is perfectly possible that the tax authorities sometimes do appear to kind of, they're sort of slight force unto themselves here. So, it may be that this happened, without the sort of specific say-so of the government, or I don't know. I'd be intrigued to hear what he says, because as you say, it comes at a rather awkward time, and particularly for the relationship between the UK and India, because I sort of I don't know who. That sounds like a police siren in the background.
Yeah, they're probably coming to take me away, I think.
Simply for, I mean, I presume for reasons of bad luck more than anything else, a disproportionate number of these companies that have got caught up in the most prominent tax cases appear to be British. There have been some big American ones like IBM and GE, but probably, you know, the 2 or 3 of the most celebrated have been British, and so it's something that's sort of particularly sensitive in the bilateral relationship.
Yeah. Can I just, you know, move the conversation slightly onwards to talk about this budget session? I mean, the budget session of Parliament is extraordinary in a certain way because it actually runs until the beginning of May, so it's a long session. Can you just clarify one point for everyone who's on the webinar? You know, we saw in the winter session of Parliament the actual legislative program of the NDA coalition being completely disrupted. There is no likelihood that the budget will not be passed. That is a question.
No, I don't think so. I mean, no, I think the budget tends to get passed. So
Right.
I don't think there's any likelihood of that happening.
Right.
Not that I'm aware of.
No. So I just wanted to kind of make it clear that as far as passage of budgeting goes, you know, it will happen. But what I did want to focus on is the other pieces of legislation, some of which are relatively, you know, important. We here in London are obviously focusing on the insurance bill, which has already gone through the Lok Sabha. But there's also issues around coal and mining, and there's critically something around the land acquisition. And we may have arguments and you know, points of view on the terms of this legislation, but it nonetheless will give clarity in certain key important areas. And I'm just wondering if you can give your view on how you see the budget session going, particularly with reference to these 4 pieces of legislation, which to a certain extent are quite important as far as important, I'd say, as the budget in terms of credibility and momentum of the government.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so let's take a step back. What happened in the last session of Parliament was, as you say, there was a good deal of political sort of fighting, mostly not to do with the particular bits of legislation, but controversies over cultural issues predominantly. So people around the BJP began sort of stirring up trouble over issues like the reconversion of Hindus who had decided to become Christians or Muslims, that sort of thing, kind of cultural issues. And that made it, there was sort of uproar in Parliament that made it much more difficult to get anything done. So the government was forced to pass a number of temporary, what they call ordinances, for instance, to allow them to re-auction coal licenses and a couple of other things. In this session, I mean, so I should premise this by saying that I am not based in Delhi and I don't tend to write about politics day to day, so I'm not quite as in touch with this as some might be. But my sense is the signs are better. The government has been planning since the failure of the last session about what to do tactically in this one, in particular in the upper house, which is where they don't have a majority and therefore they have to cobble together coalitions to get any of their bills passed. So they've been thinking about this a good deal. They've already managed to pass one bill, the mining bill, although that wasn't the most controversial. The insurance bill, long awaited and not terribly controversial, has been tabled in the upper house today, and people seem to think that finally, this one might now pass, although I'll believe it when I can see it. The government, to give it its view, has dug its heels in on the issue of land acquisition, and so is trying to sort of push that one through. They haven't, although they have come up with some compromises to try and sort of win support over that. So it's difficult. I mean, I think if there are no distractions, then the signs are sort of moderately positive that least some of these bills might get passed, and that would be a further kind of fillip to prove that there is an endless deadlock. However, the risk of distractions is an almost daily occurrence. So some of you may have seen yesterday, we also wrote about this in the FT this morning, that the former Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, was yesterday summoned to appear in front of a court to answer questions about allegations of corruption in allocation of coal mining rights way back in 2005. That sort of thing can be enough to sort of make it basically impossible to have discussions over legislation in Parliament, because other sort of fracas will break out between the different political parties. And so I think Mr. Modi needs to hope that basically nothing untoward or unexpected occurs that will knock them off course, and then I think there's a reasonable chance that some of these long-awaited pieces of legislation may pass in this session.
Okay. A conversation that we had previously, and just by way of wrap up on for my part, is obviously the forward earnings as implied in the stock exchange are I think somewhere in the region of 18 to 20% increase. Clearly, taking into context where the economy is, taking into context the budget, how do you feel the stock exchange is looking at the future? Is it being over optimistic? Do you think earnings growth for Indian industry will be able to meet those targets, or is it going to be is it going to undershoot?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to say. If I knew where the stock market was going to go, I'd be a fund manager rather than a journalist. I suppose the positive case, most people seem to think the Sensex is. What's that? I'm just looking at my television screen. I can't actually see where it's reached today. It's up a little bit. Most people seem to think that it will, go up by another sort of 15-20% by the end of this year. So we're still in a territory of, sort of market optimism, maybe 33,000 rather than 28,000, 29,000 where we are at the moment. Earnings growth, as you say, the forward earning ratio is at about 19, which is slightly above its long-term average and much higher than most other emerging markets, but not much above its long-term average, if you see what I mean. So it's perfectly plausible that if there are more reforms, more sort of surprises on the upside, as the analysts would say, that they could go faster than that. And certainly it's a sort of at a much more simple level. Things are basically looking more positive. I've been here for 3 years. That's basically been 3 years of weak single-digit earning growth. So the fact that people now think that earnings are going to grow 15-20% over the course of this financial year is much, much better than has been the case over recent years. So as I say, it's a sort of broadly sort of positive picture. Whether or not the market is kind of over-egging this or not, I'll leave for others to judge.
And disinvestment, clearly the government undershot its targets for disinvestment last year. And, practically from a philosophical point of view, Modi is, if you look at what he did in the state of Gujarat, was not a huge proponent of disinvestment, although the previous BJP administration under Vajpayee certainly, executed quite a number of disinvestments. Do you think that will be a theme for next year? Clearly, it helps plug, fiscal issues, but it's not something the government has necessarily beaten the drum about.
Well, so yeah, the target for disinvestment is higher next year. It includes a sort of unexplained portion, which is called strategic disinvestment, which is meant to be, instead of just selling off little bits of state companies, this is meant to be the wholesale transfer of public companies into the private sector, or at least majority stake. So there should be more of this. I think one could include this in your area of potential disappointments, because the traditional criticism of governments in India selling off bits of state-owned assets, sort of selling off the family silver, as it were, is that they will sell off 5 or 10% in company X or Y, be it a state-owned oil company or Coal India, the coal monopoly, but they won't actually do anything to improve how the company is run. And therefore, you end up with exactly the same, normally quite poorly performing company with a bit more of it held by foreign investors. Most people think a better way of doing that would be to announce reforms to the way the companies are run, let them pay their chief executives closer to market rates, give them more freedom to operate, bring in new management, all sorts of things that you can do. And then not only will they run better, but you should be able to increase the amount of money that you earn from them. So far, the government hasn't really shown any signs of doing that. It made some moderate announcements on state-run banks, but nothing terribly exciting, and really nothing at all that I could find on some of the other larger companies. So it remains to be seen whether this government's attitude to disinvestment is really any different from the last one. If what they end up doing is just selling off more of these companies without changing how they are run, then that would be quite disappointing, I think, given that India still has a fairly state-dominated economy, and in the medium term, there's no particular reason why you need to have, state-run coal miners or state-run steel companies or that sort of thing, and so a sort of gradual movement of reform and transferring some of those assets towards the private sector, I think most economists would think is a good idea.
Okay, well, we'll watch that space, but clearly it's an area where the UK has expertise, which may be of use going forward. One final question from me, not as flippant as it may sound, but how are you doing on the ban on beef? How's that affecting you?
Oh, well, not at all. I'm a vegetarian, so I'm thoroughly in favour of beef bans and all other bans on meat as well. So if they
but it is, nonetheless, it is curious that suddenly the pressure from the Maharashtra government, the president signs into law an act that was passed by both houses in 1995, which results in the ban on the culling and indeed import and consumption of beef in the state of Maharashtra.
It's slightly curious. I mean, in a funny way, getting back to what we were talking about before, sort of events that might derail the reform process. That's exactly the sort of thing that in India you fear might happen. I mean, in the end, the beef ban hasn't turned out to be tremendously controversial. The pro-beef lobby is relatively limited to sort of, hoteliers and people who like a steak from time to time. So it hasn't kind of brought people out onto the streets in the way that some other things do. But the risk is that something of that sort could very well happen, over the course of the next few weeks and cause greater controversy, which in turn could impede the ability of the government to get done what it needs to get done in Parliament. So, but as for the hard-working FT correspondent in Mumbai, the beef ban has been neither here nor there.
Okay. Well, I'm pleased to hear that you're surviving them okay. I think that we're going to wrap it up there. I have to say that we have not had any questions registered. I presume that's because your answers to my questions have been so all-encompassing. But we will nevertheless make the webinar available on our website. And James, thank you very much for your time. And everyone who's listening, I hope the webinar was valuable to you. And if you have any feedback or comments on today's session, or indeed whether there's a session you'd like us to do in the future, then please feel free to get in touch. And thank you for joining us. And as I have said twice already, and I'll say it a third time, it's great to wake up to James Crabtree's blog. So please subscribe to it, read it, and follow it, because it really is quite illuminating as to James's views on what's going on in India across a range of subjects. So James, thank you very much indeed, and I wish you all the best for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. All the best.
God bless.